Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in European history, a saga of Edward III and the Black Prince, of Henry V and Joan of Arc, of Charles V the Wise, and Charles VI the Mad, the 100 Years' War, a struggle that dragged on for more than a century, reshaped kingdoms, shattered families, and turned the map of Europe into a battlefield. It's a story of kings and crowns, but also of merchants, mercenaries, and ordinary people caught in the storm. Before we jump into how this slow-motion disaster unfolded, grab a drink, coffee, tea, or whatever fuels you, take a moment to hit the like button, and if you truly enjoy the content I share here, subscribe for more of the historically absurd. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see just how far these tales travel. Alright, let's go back to where it all begins. France, 1328. A king is dead, the throne is empty, and the stage is set for a quarrel that would ignite a century of war. When Charles IV of France exhaled his last breath in 1328, Paris did not erupt in mourning so much as in anxiety. The Capetian line, which had ruled France unbroken for centuries, had run out of male heirs. The bloodline that once seemed as permanent as the Seine itself had thinned to nothing in a single generation. The throne of France, glittering and dangerous, now stood empty, and every claimant in Europe could smell the opportunity. At first, the question seemed simple. Who had the strongest claim? Among the nobles, two names surfaced like rival sharks, circling the same waters. On one side, Philip of Valois, first cousin to Charles IV, a man with respectable bloodlines and, importantly, a very French identity. On the other side, Edward III of England, a grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother Isabella. If genealogy were a corporate ladder, Edward stood one rung higher. The problem? He was also a foreign king. For the French barons, crowning him felt less like upholding tradition and more like handing the kingdom over to the English. Here enters the ghost of Salic law, an old Frankish legal code dug out of obscurity like a weapon from the attic. The French magnates declared that women could not transmit claims to the crown, a rule that had never been consistently applied before. In one stroke, Edward's claim was erased. The throne, they insisted, must go to Philip of Valois, who was crowned Philip VI of France in Reims. It was neat. It was decisive. It was also political theatre dressed up as legal precedent. To Edward III, the decision tasted like betrayal mixed with humiliation. At the time, he was barely 20, still solidifying his rule in England after years of regency under his formidable mother, Isabella, and her disgraced partner, Roger Mortimer. Edward wasn't yet ready for war, but he wasn't about to forget the insult. In the meantime, he swallowed his pride and outwardly accepted Philip as his overlord for Aquitaine, the jewel of English holdings in France. But in the back of his mind, the fire was already lit. Whispers fanned those flames. Chief among them was Robert of Artois, a disgraced French noble whose personal vendetta against Philip VI made him the perfect agent of chaos. Robert had been stripped of his inheritance after a bitter legal battle and found himself skulking in exile, desperate for revenge. He whispered in Edward's ear, "You have the rightful claim. You are the true king of France, and together we can make it so." His words weren't just flattery. They were poison. Poison that sank deep. Meanwhile, Philip VI wasted no time in flexing his new royal muscles. He needed to prove his crown wasn't just a paper crown, and that meant securing loyalty from the great magnates. His reign began with pomp, parades, and oaths of fealty. Yet beneath the glitter of coronation, ceremonies lay a dangerous truth. Many lords were skeptical. They had not chosen Philip because they loved him, but because he was convenient. Convenience can evaporate quickly when armies are involved. Edward, ever the strategist, played along with his role as dutiful vassal, at least at first. In 1329, he knelt before Philip in Amiens, performing homage for Aquitaine. But the act was laced with tension. Was it liege homage, the kind that bound him completely to Philip? Or merely symbolic homage, more like a nod of acknowledgement than a promise of obedience? The legal ambiguity would fester, a time bomb in the making. Both kings left the ceremony unsatisfied, each convinced the other was lying through their teeth. By choosing Philip, The French lords had temporarily secured stability, yet in doing so, they had planted the seeds of the longest war in medieval Europe. Edward's claim was not just a personal vendetta, it became a rallying cry for English ambitions across the Channel. Merchants saw opportunity in a divided France, soldiers smelled plunder, even the clergy found ways to frame Edward's claim as divinely sanctioned. What began as a squabble over inheritance was mutating into a wider conflict, fueled by money, pride, and opportunists like Robert of Artois who thrived in the cracks. The irony, of course, is that neither Philip nor Edward truly cared about the law. Both were playing the same game: survival and expansion. Philip needed to defend the integrity of France, to keep the crown from slipping into foreign hands. Edward needed to turn the insult of Amiens into the spark of defiance. Both had something to prove, and both would use every ounce of cunning, diplomacy, and violence to get it. France, for the moment, appeared united under Philip VI. England, for the moment, appeared compliant. But history was already turning toward blood. The throne had been filled, yes, but in the process, it had been fractured, and the fracture lines were spreading. Because here's the thing about thrones, they're never truly empty. Even when someone's sitting on them, someone else is always waiting for them to fall. For a few years after Philip VI's coronation, the uneasy truce held. Edward III bowed, smiled, and played the role of dutiful vassal. Philip VI strutted about as though Salic law had ended all debate. But beneath the surface, fault lines cracked wider. And those cracks weren't just about crowns, they were about trade, money, and the lifeblood of two kingdoms, wine and wool. Aquitaine, the jewel of the English crown's holdings in France, was more than just fertile land. It was a wine empire. The Gascon vineyards shipped casks northward in an endless stream, and English merchants gulped it down like lifeblood. Bordeaux was practically a second London, its ports lined with barrels destined for taverns across England. Edward III could no more give up Gascony than he could give up his crown. It wasn't just a duchy. It was dinner, drink, and treasury all in one. But Philip VI wanted to remind Edward that Aquitaine was no independent kingdom. It was French land, and Edward held it only as a tenant. Feudal obligations became Philip's favourite weapon. He summoned Edward repeatedly, demanding appearances in French courts, demanding judgments that chipped away at his authority. For Edward, it was humiliation by paperwork, a death by 1,000 parchments. This wasn't just politics. It was insult layered over insult. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Flemish cities simmered like an economic powder keg. Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres were centres of Europe's booming cloth industry, dependent on one critical resource: English wool. No wool, no looms. No looms, no profit. The French crown might claim sovereignty over Flanders, but money doesn't listen to banners. Flemish merchants leaned heavily toward England, their livelihoods tied to Edward's sheep rather than Philip's decrees. This was where politics and economy intertwined like strangling vines. Philip VI tried to squeeze Flanders into obedience, propping up pro-French factions among the city leaders. But merchants don't enjoy being strangled. Every time Philip cracked down, resentment grew, and every time Edward hinted at supporting Flemish independence, his popularity in the cloth towns soared. By the 1330s, Flemish guild leaders were murmuring that maybe, just maybe, an English king of France wasn't such a bad idea after all. Of course, merchants weren't the only ones hedging their bets. Nobles in Gascony lived in a limbo of loyalty. They were technically vassals of the French king, but their rents, profits, and protection flowed through England. Many were bilingual in loyalty, speaking French in Philip's courts and swearing English oaths in Edward's halls. It was less about national identity, a concept still centuries away, and more about who kept their purses full and their castles safe. The economic stakes only escalated the tension. English wool was England's financial backbone. Gascon wine was its beating heart. Philip's manoeuvres threatened both. By leveraging feudal law against Edward, Philip wasn't just asserting dominance, he was poking at the arteries of England's economy. It was less about legal precedent, more about strategic suffocation. Edward, still young but increasingly shrewd, recognized the danger. He began cultivating allies in Flanders, dangling promises of trade privileges and protection. In return, the Flemish guilds offered what kings crave most: money. Taxes, loans, and supplies could turn Edward's claim on the French throne from a dream into a campaign. Suddenly, the English cause wasn't just a family squabble. It was a coalition of merchants, nobles, and discontented city-states, all with something to gain if France fractured. Philip VI, for his part, saw what was happening. He tightened control, issued edicts, and leaned on loyal factions to counterbalance English influence. But every move deepened resentment. What looked like royal authority in Paris looked like tyranny in Bruges. And in politics, perception is reality. By the mid-1330s, the war wasn't yet declared, but it was already being fought, in markets, in courts, and in the smoky backrooms of Flemish guild halls. The battlefield was not yet littered with corpses, but with parchment, tariffs, and oaths of shifting allegiance. And when those tools failed, as they inevitably would, the swords would come out. Because here's the cruel joke of medieval economics: sheep and grapes may feed a kingdom, but sooner or later, they also feed a war. The gloves finally came off in 1337. After years of feudal paperwork, petty summons, and thinly veiled insults, Philip VI of France declared that Edward III had forfeited Aquitaine. It was the medieval equivalent of an eviction notice, only this wasn't about rent, it was about tearing away the heart of England's continental empire. Edward's response? If the French crown insisted he was no longer Duke of Aquitaine, then fine. He would stop pretending Philip was his overlord and instead claim the French throne outright. If you're going to fight over scraps, better to fight over the whole feast. This was the official start of the 100 Years' War, though few realized it would drag on for a century. At first, it looked like a family feud gone international. Edward III wasn't just making legal arguments anymore. He was raising banners, calling in loans, and painting the lilies of France onto his coat of arms. From London to Bruges, from Bordeaux to Calais, people now had to pick sides in a war that seemed both absurd and inevitable. The early years were messy, less grand battles than vicious raids. Edward's forces struck where they could, burning villages in northern France, hoping to undermine Philip's prestige. Philip's men retaliated with their own chevauchés into Gascony, torching crops and taking prisoners. It was warfare as pest control, fast-moving, destructive, designed to choke the enemy's economy rather than deliver a decisive clash. Civilians paid the highest price, their homes converted into ash in wars they had no voice in. But 1338-1339 brought something new, alliances shifting like quicksand. Edward forged ties with the Holy Roman Emperor, Ludwig IV, buying German support with promises and coin. He drew Flemish cities openly to his banner, securing both troops and loans. For a time, it looked like France might be surrounded, strangled by Edward's coalition. Philip VI, meanwhile, relied on the papacy and traditional allies to keep the diplomatic scales balanced. The war wasn't just fought on land, it was waged across Europe's royal courts, every banquet table doubling as a battlefield. By 1340, the conflict escalated to the sea. Philip VI assembled a massive fleet, bolstered by hired Mediterranean galleys. Their mission was simple: invade England, strike at Edward directly, and end the war before it spread further. For a moment, the threat was terrifying. An invasion fleet in the Channel was no idle rumour. England itself was in danger. Edward knew he couldn't let that armada sail unchecked. He gathered his own fleet, a patchwork of pressed merchant ships armed with archers and soldiers. What the English lacked in naval polish, they made up for with a terrifying secret weapon, the longbow. When the fleets clashed at Sluys in June 1340, the sea itself seemed to choke on bodies. The English lashed their ships together to form floating fortresses, turning the battle into a brutal melee. The Genoese crossbowmen never had a chance. Their weapons, deadly in open-field battles, were slow and clumsy in the rocking chaos of sea combat. English longbowmen rained arrows down like iron hail, cutting down sailors before they could reload. Once the Genoese line buckled, Edward's men boarded the French ships, hacking their way across decks slick with blood and seawater. Chroniclers claimed the Channel turned red that day, clogged with corpses drifting like driftwood. The result was catastrophic for Philip VI. Nearly his entire fleet was annihilated, leaving France exposed. Control of the seas shifted to England, and the spectre of invasion now hung over France instead. Sluys wasn't just a naval battle, it was a statement. England, smaller and poorer, had shown it could humiliate France on the open water. The war was no longer about who had the better lawyers. It was about who could survive the storm. Yet, for all Edward's triumph, the victory did not end the war. It only escalated it. Philip, stung, dug in harder. Edward, emboldened, demanded more. Neither side had delivered a knockout blow, and neither intended to quit. The chevauchés would continue, the alliances would shift, and the bloodletting would only grow worse. Because the real truth of Sluys wasn't in the numbers of ships sunk or men drowned. It was in the lesson it taught both kingdoms. This war would not be quick, it would not be clean, and it would not be merciful. By the early 1340s, Edward III was done with symbolic raids and naval skirmishes. The war had been simmering for years, and after Sluys he realized the struggle was no longer a border quarrel, but the prelude to a continental invasion. If he truly meant to claim the crown of France, it wouldn't be through parchment or small-scale chevauchée. He needed a full-scale invasion, one that would terrify Philip VI and prove to Europe that England could do the impossible. March deep into the heart of France. In 1346, Edward landed in Normandy with a massive force, perhaps 15,000 men, a mix of knights, men-at-arms, and his lethal corps of longbowmen. To the French peasants, the arrival of English ships on their coast must have looked like a nightmare spilling from the sea. This wasn't a border skirmish anymore. This was the King of England himself, with banners flying and drums pounding, planting his flag on French soil. The message to Philip VI was blunt: "Your throne is mine, and I will burn your kingdom until you recognize it." Edward's army moved like a plague. He leaned on chevauchée tactics. Fields were burned, villages reduced to ash, livestock slaughtered or driven off. The point was not merely destruction, but psychology. If Philip could not protect his people, then how strong was his crown? Chroniclers describe the trail of devastation as almost biblical, smoke columns rising across Normandy like black candles in a kingdom-wide funeral. The English didn't march silently, they wanted to be seen. Every village they torched was a message. Every church desecrated was a warning. Edward wasn't trying to conquer Normandy piece by piece. He was trying to break France's will before armies ever clashed. In a world where kings were supposed to embody divine protection, Philip's inability to stop this destruction struck at the very heart of his legitimacy. Philip VI was not blind to the threat. He summoned his nobility, calling in every possible vassal to assemble a massive host. This was not just a defensive measure. It was a chance to crush Edward once and for all, to show that France's knights could still uphold the honor of their kingdom. Thousands answered the call, their banners fluttering in defiance. But assembling an army took time, and time, against a chevauchée, meant more ashes on the horizon. Meanwhile, Edward's march was no aimless wandering. His route cut across northern France with calculated cruelty. He aimed for the Seine, threatening Paris itself, forcing Philip to scramble his forces to defend the capital. But Edward was cunning. He avoided being trapped, slipping away when French forces closed in, always keeping his army supplied by plunder. The longer Philip chased him, the more his kingdom suffered. It was like fighting smoke. Every time you thought you had it cornered, it slipped through your fingers and set another fire. For the English soldiers, this was profitable work. Loot, prisoners, and ransom money filled their purses. For the civilians caught in the path, it was horror beyond imagination. Families were butchered, villages disappeared overnight, and famine followed in the army's wake. War in the 14th century was not a clash of armies in isolated fields. It was a rolling apocalypse, and Normandy was its latest victim. By late summer, both sides were closing in. Edward could not raid forever. He needed a decisive confrontation to prove his claim wasn't just smoke and ashes. Philip, pressured by his nobles, could not allow the English to continue without battle. The two armies maneuvered toward each other, France gathering overwhelming numbers, England relying on discipline and longbows. The road was narrowing toward a single bloody encounter. The war had shifted. It was no longer about lawyers, claims, or treaties. It was no longer just about Gascony or Flemish merchants. It was about survival of two monarchies, one old, one daring to replace it, and the collision would not be delayed much longer, because at the end of that scorched road lay Crécy, and Crécy would prove that the Age of Knights was not immortal, but fragile, a glass sword waiting to be shattered. By 1346, the 100 Years' War had shed its disguise. What began as a squabble over feudal law, a cousin against a grandson, a loophole in Salic law, had mutated into something far greater. The legal quarrel had hardened into open invasion, two crowns now fighting in steel, not statute. Philip VI had the numbers, the prestige, the weight of tradition. Edward III had the longbow, the Flemish merchants, and the audacity to wear the lilies of France on his coat of arms. Their clash was inevitable, and every burned village, every drowned sailor, every broken oath, had been pulling them toward it. Normandy had been ravaged, the countryside left smoking, and Philip's nobles demanded blood to restore their honour. All roads now pointed to Crécy. There, French confidence meets English positioning and breaks. The war may have started in chancery chambers, but its next chapter would be written on churned mud. But its true voice was thunder. The thunder of hooves, of arrows loosed in clouds, of kingdoms breaking against one another. And at Crécy, the world would hear it for the first time. So far, we've seen how a disputed succession set England and France on a collision course. Edward III claimed the French crown, Philip VI fought to hold it, and years of raids and sea battles turned argument into campaign. Now, the war erupts on a scale neither kingdom can ignore. In 1346, the fields of Normandy became the stage for a reckoning, the Battle of Crécy. Here, a rain-slick rise and disciplined ranks turned pursuit into rout. But Crécy was only the first blow. What followed was a decade of catastrophe and conquest that scarred France, humbled its nobility, and turned a dynastic quarrel into a national calamity. The summer of 1346 brought France to its moment of reckoning. Philip VI called his banners, and they came in dazzling numbers, dukes, counts, and knights, each with their retinues, armour gleaming, confident that sheer weight of nobility would crush the English. This was not just an army, it was the embodiment of France's feudal order, riding to defend the crown. Edward III, by contrast, had spent weeks ravaging the countryside in a chevauchée that left blackened villages and frightened peasants in his wake. Now cornered near the village of Crécy, he chose not to flee but to make a stand. His army was smaller, weary, but positioned on a gentle rise of ground, a natural fortress. Stakes were driven into the soil to blunt cavalry charges, ditches dug to snarl horses, and lines of archers arrayed with clear fields of fire. Philip's opening move came with the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries from the Mediterranean. They were experienced fighters, but they had marched all day in the rain, their bowstrings soaked, and their shields left behind in the baggage train. When their first volley sputtered out short of the English line, the longbows answered with devastating force. Arrows fell in sheets, piercing mail, horses, and men alike. The mercenaries broke, only to be trampled by the very French knights who cursed their failure. Then, the real disaster began. Mounted charges came in glittering waves, banners flying, lances lowered. But the slope slowed them, the mud dragged at their horses, and the longbows scythed through them with mechanical rhythm. Chroniclers tell of knights clawing their way over heaps of corpses, only to be cut down again. Some fell before they even reached the English line, their armour ringing like struck anvils under the storm of arrows. Among the defenders stood Edward's teenage son, the Prince of Wales, remembered to history as the Black Prince. His division bore the brunt of the French onslaught. When courtiers begged Edward to send help, the king refused. Let the boy earn his spurs. And so he did, holding firm as chaos raged around him, proving that England's future lay not just with its longbowmen, but with a prince hardened by blood. By nightfall, the field was a charnel house. The blind king of Bohemia, refusing to sit idle, had asked his knights to tie his reins to theirs so he might ride into the fray. His corpse was found among the fallen, his crest later adopted by the Black Prince as a mark of honour. Around him lay the bodies of counts, dukes, and nobles, the highest ranks of France, cut down like common soldiers. Chroniclers estimated that a third of the French nobility perished that day. Philip VI himself barely escaped, wounded and humiliated. For France, the loss was not simply military, it was symbolic. On that slope at Crécy, pedigree stopped mattering. Across Europe, whispers spread. The knight was no longer master of the battlefield. Steel and lineage had met their match in discipline and the longbow. And yet, the English were not finished. With France stunned and its nobility in mourning, Edward's army turned north. Their next target was not another battlefield, but a city whose defiance would drag England into one of the longest and most infamous sieges of the war, Calais. After Crécy, the English army pushed north to the Channel coast. Their destination was Calais, a fortress city whose harbour made it the key to northern France. Whoever held Calais controlled the shortest sea route to England. For Edward III, it wasn't just a prize, it was a gateway to permanent conquest. The siege began in September 1346, and Edward meant to stay as long as it took. He built an entire siege city outside Calais, rows of timber houses, markets, taverns, even windmills and brothels. Chroniclers called it New Calais, a wooden twin strangling its stone parent. What was meant to break the French defenders also made Edward's men comfortable enough to wait out the year. Inside the walls, famine grew unbearable. The garrison sent away useless mouths, women, children, the elderly, only for Edward to refuse them passage. They lingered miserably between the two cities, neither side willing to feed them. By spring, food was so scarce that dogs, cats, and even old horses became meals. Hunger, not arrows, hollowed out the defenders. Philip VI tried to save the city, but his chance was gone. He mustered an army, but Edward's siege works, reinforced with ditches, palisades, and naval blockades in the harbour, made an assault hopeless. Demoralised and unwilling to risk another Crécy, the French army retreated. Calais was abandoned. In August 1347, the gates opened. 6 burghers, the wealthiest citizens, walked barefoot, clad only in shirts with ropes around their necks and the keys to the city in their hands. They expected death, but Philippa of Hainault, Edward's queen, fell to her knees before her husband. Heavily pregnant, she begged for mercy. Edward relented. The 6 lived, but the image of their humiliation would echo across centuries, later immortalized in Rodin's haunting sculpture, The Burghers of Calais. The reprieve was only symbolic. Edward expelled the entire French population, perhaps 4,000 souls, and replaced them with English colonists. Calais was no longer a French city under occupation. It was English soil, a beachhead that would remain in English hands for 2 centuries. For the French crown, Calais was a deeper wound than Crécy. A lost battle could be blamed on chance or rash tactics, but the fall of a great city after a year of hunger proved something darker. England was not raiding France. It was rooting itself in it. And as Calais settled into its new role as England's continental stronghold, one figure stood out among the victors. The teenage prince whose trial by fire at Crécy was only the beginning of his legend. When the smoke cleared at Crécy, it wasn't Edward III who captured Europe's imagination, but his teenage son. Edward of Woodstock, just 16 years old, had stood in the thick of the slaughter, his armour dented, his banner flying. The boy had fought not as a protected heir but as a commander, and from that day chroniclers marked him for destiny. Later generations would call him the Black Prince, though whether for his dark armour or his dark reputation, no one could say. He bore more than a name. From the body of the blind King of Bohemia, slain at Crécy, he took the crest of 3 ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich diene, I serve. That emblem became his signature, a reminder that his fame was born in the ruin of Europe's nobility. The prince's reputation grew not only from his bloodline, but from his mastery of war's harshest tools. He made the chevauchée his signature. Fields were torched at harvest time, villages stripped of food, and terrified peasants driven into flight. This was not honourable combat. It was war, as economic strangulation and psychological torment. And Edward of Woodstock proved its most ruthless practitioner. Yet he was not simply feared. Among his men, he was admired for marching and dining alongside them. sharing their hardships and distributing plunder generously. To allies, he was the model of knightly courtesy. To enemies, he was a phantom of fire and iron. This contradiction, the chivalric ideal and the merciless destroyer bound in one man, became the essence of his legend. By the early 1350s, it was clear that England's war was no longer just Edward III's project. The prince had become its symbol, a dark star rising over France. His raids were not passing storms but omens of a generational struggle. The heir of England had carved his reputation in flame, and the Valois crown trembled at his shadow. But shadows deepen before they break. In 1356, the boy who blooded himself at Crécy would stand at the head of an army outnumbered and surrounded. What followed was not a chevauchée, nor a siege, but a battle that would deliver France its greatest humiliation. The prize was not land, it was a king. By 1356, Edward of Woodstock was no longer just the boy knight of Crécy. He commanded his own hardened host, a mobile army of 6,000 that cut through France with chevauchée timed to harvest, torching fields and daring the crown to respond. France could no longer endure the humiliation. King John II, remembered as John the Good, gathered a massive army, perhaps twice the size of the prince's, determined to end the English terror. The two forces met near Poitiers in September. John II had numbers, banners, and the hopes of a desperate kingdom. The Black Prince had exhaustion, hunger, and a mastery of terrain. He anchored his men behind hedges and vineyards, the flanks guarded by longbowmen. It looked like desperation, but it was bait. Unlike Crécy, the French had learned. Many knights dismounted, advancing on foot with discipline. Yet the ground betrayed them. Choked by hedgerows and narrow lanes, their formations broke apart, showered by arrows. Horses fell screaming, men slipped in the mud, banners vanished in the crush. Chroniclers describe noblemen suffocating under their own comrades, buried alive in armor. Then came the turn. The Black Prince, waiting for the moment, launched his cavalry in a sudden counterstroke. Fresh men-at-arms crashed into the exhausted French, flipping the battle in an instant. What had begun as an assault dissolved into a rout. Nobles scattered, whole companies surrendered, thousands were cut down. And in the maelstrom, the king himself was surrounded. John II fought fiercely with his household knights, his youngest son beside him, but no courage could withstand the tide. Forced to yield, he declared, "I am the king, take me to your leader." Moments later, the crown of France was a prisoner of war. The capture was shattering. Along with John came hundreds of nobles, bound for ransom. The price set for the king's release was staggering, 3 million écus, a fortune that would cripple France's treasury and heap crushing taxes on its people. Worse still was the humiliation. The divine monarch of France paraded as Edward III's prize, reduced to a bargaining chip. For the Valois dynasty, it was disaster beyond Crécy or Calais. A king in chains meant more than a lost battle. It meant a broken kingdom. In Paris, the Estates General would rise to fill the void. In the countryside, unrest would simmer toward open revolt. The monarchy still wore its crown, but in truth, it was shackled. And as England sharpened its knives, France stumbled into chaos, a kingdom wounded not just in body but in soul. In barely 10 years, the kingdom of France had been broken, its nobility slaughtered in open fields, its great port city emptied and colonized, its king dragged away in chains. What had once seemed the richest and most powerful monarchy in Christendom now stood hollow, its glory stripped by fire and iron. At the center of this storm rose Edward of Woodstock, no longer the boy knight of Crécy. The Black Prince had become the embodiment of English conquest, a commander whose chevauchées turned farmland into wasteland, whose victories carried terror from Flanders to the Pyrenees. Where Edward III had claimed France through parchment, his son seemed intent on claiming it through ruin. For France, defeat now meant more than lost battles. A king in captivity left the throne trembling, his ransom threatening to bankrupt the kingdom, his absence inviting unrest. Faith in divine monarchy withered. Peasants and nobles alike wondered if the Valois crown had lost heaven's favor. By 1356, the 100 Years' War had become something darker than a dynastic quarrel. It was a struggle for survival. England now held a doorway on the French coast, and the key. And worse still, The enemy ahead was not across the channel, but within its own borders. Famine, revolt, betrayal, and a rival monarch whose name already spread, in whispers, Charles the Bad. The King of France was a prisoner, not just beaten, not just humiliated, but paraded like a trophy across the channel, a royal prize in English hands. His kingdom, meanwhile, was bleeding to death. Armies of mercenaries roamed the countryside, plundering villages like wolves in an abandoned sheepfold. Paris itself teetered on revolt. Into this vacuum of power stepped men who smelled opportunity. A young dauphin struggling to hold authority with trembling hands. A merchant uprising that stormed palaces with ropes and steel. And a rival noble, Charles of Navarre, the Bad, whose ambition was matched only by his flair for treachery. France wasn't just losing the war. It was fracturing into chaos, the very idea of monarchy itself wobbling on the edge of collapse. This was not a kingdom at war. This was a kingdom eating itself alive. And from the ruins would emerge one of France's most unlikely survivors, a prince mocked as timid, who would be recast as the wise, and a general as brutal as he was brilliant. But before France could claw its way back, it had to survive the nightmare of its own unraveling. John II of France, known as John the Good, was anything but fortunate. His defeat at Poitiers left France without a monarch, and that single fact rippled through every corner of the kingdom. Nobles who once barely tolerated the Valois crown now tested its limits, each one calculating whether loyalty was worth the price of ruin. The monarchy had been fragile even before John's capture. Now it seemed hollow, like a crown with no head to wear it. Edward III of England understood that the real prize was not just a king in chains, but the psychological conquest of France itself. London became a stage where the King of France was paraded, not in chains, but in robes, seated at banquets as if an honoured guest. Chroniclers praised the courtesy of the English court, yet everyone knew the truth. This was theatre. Every feast, every ride through London's streets, was a pointed reminder that France's monarchy had become a prop in England's performance of power. But diplomacy is where humiliation turned to mutilation. Edward's negotiators dragged talks across years, not because agreement was difficult, but because delay itself was leverage. Each passing season deepened France's desperation. The king's ransom ballooned into the impossible, 3 million écus, a figure that dwarfed the royal treasury. Yet ransom was only part of the trap. Edward demanded entire provinces, Aquitaine to become an English dominion, Normandy and Poitou peeled away, and the old Angevin dream of a dual kingdom revived on parchment. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was less an agreement than a national amputation. Maps of France redrawn overnight left swaths of territory shaded with English lions, not French fleur-de-lis, and the ink itself may as well have been blood. John promised noble hostages, sons of France's greatest families, delivered as collateral to English custody. Entire dynasties were forced to gamble their heirs on a king's parole. Financing the ransom was a torment that reached into every hut and market stall. New taxes sprouted like weeds, squeezing peasants already living on the edge of survival. Merchants groaned under levies that strangled trade. Resentment brewed, not quietly but openly. Chroniclers noted villages rioting when tax collectors appeared, mobs armed with pitchforks and axes, their fury stoked by hunger. For them, the ransom was not about honor. It was about whether their families would eat through winter. And John himself clung to an outdated code of chivalric honor, even when it became poison to his country. When one of his sons, held as hostage, escaped English custody, John made the astonishing decision to return to London voluntarily, claiming a king's word must be ironclad. To his knights, this was noble. To his people, it was lunacy. France did not need a king of honor. It needed a king present on French soil. His choice condemned him to die in English hands in 1364, a monarch remembered more for his gallantry than for governing. What remained in France was not just a wounded kingdom, but one spiraling into lawlessness. Bands of unemployed mercenaries, no longer tethered by contracts, roamed the countryside like predators. Local lords fortified towns as though defending against invasion, not from the English but from their own countrymen. The monarchy was absent, ransom drained the economy, and the nobility wavered between loyalty and opportunism. By the time John II's body lay cold in London, France was already a country unravelling. The war had left it scarred, but the ransom and captivity left it hollow. What came next would not be decided on the battlefield alone. It would be decided by whether France could even hold itself together as a functioning kingdom. With King John rotting in English captivity, France turned to his heir, the Dauphin Charles. Unfortunately for him, nothing in his upbringing had prepared him for this storm. He wasn't a warrior like his father. He wasn't charismatic like his rivals. He was cautious, soft-spoken, and deeply suspicious of everyone around him. To most, he looked like the wrong man at the wrong time, though history would later call that judgment premature. Charles inherited not a crown but a kingdom in freefall. Across the countryside, mercenary armies once contracted for war were now unemployed and ravenous. These so-called grandes companies transformed into predators. They didn't simply loot. They besieged villages, extorted abbeys, and even forced towns to pay for protection, much like bandits dressed in chainmail. One of their most notorious leaders, Arnaud de Servaulx, the so-called archpriest, commanded thousands of these freebooters, turning whole provinces into his private hunting ground. For peasants, they were not soldiers. They were a plague made of men. The nobility, meanwhile, had little interest in obeying a dauphin barely out of his teens. Many saw him as weak, a placeholder until King John returned. Some courtiers whispered of replacing him altogether. For a fragile monarchy, it was a recipe for collapse. And at the heart of this chaos stood Paris, restless, defiant, and brimming with rage at the royal government. Enter Etienne Marcel, provost of the Parisian merchants. He was no knight, no noble, but he had something more potent: money, organization, and the backing of a furious populace. The merchants were tired of financing failure. They had poured silver into ransom demands and endless campaigns, yet nothing improved. The Dauphin's court, to them, looked less like a government than a drain. In 1357, Marcel pushed through reforms meant to chain royal power: oversight on taxation, limits on authority, new councils of merchants and nobles. On paper, it was constitutionalism. In practice, it was a direct challenge to monarchy. Negotiations soured into hostility, and hostility curdled into blood. The breaking point came in February 1358, when Marcel's supporters stormed the Dauphin's palace. Before the trembling Charles, they hacked down two of his closest advisors, staining the royal chambers with gore. Charles himself was spared, but only as a hostage to the fury of Paris. The message was unmistakable. The capital would tolerate a king, but not a monarch unchecked. For months, Paris was a city under revolt. Marcel, draped in his symbolic red and blue hood, paraded through the streets like an anti-king, while Charles was reduced to a prisoner inside his own capital. If ever France looked ready to implode, this was it. The English scarcely needed to invade, France was tearing itself apart. But revolutions are fragile, especially when trust breaks. By mid-1358, Marcel's flirtation with the English crossed a line. For Parisians, resistance was one thing, treason was another. When he tried to open the city gates to English troops, the backlash was furious. A mob slaughtered him in the streets, and power lurched back into the Dauphin's hands. Charles, pale but alive, had survived his first trial. He had shown none of the swagger of a warrior king, but in keeping calm, waiting, and outlasting his enemies, he displayed the first glimpse of the man who would one day be called Charles the Wise. Yet survival was not the same as stability. The kingdom still seethed with unrest, its loyalty fractured, its economy strangled, its fields pillaged. And waiting in the wings was a rival whose ambition would gnaw at France for decades. Charles of Navarre, the Bad, an opportunist so slippery that betrayal seemed less like treason and more like instinct. If France was a bleeding body, Charles of Navarre was the vulture circling overhead. Known to history as Charles the Bad, he lived up to the name with relish. His claim to power came through his mother, Joan II of Navarre, a daughter of the French royal line. That made him a Valois cousin, and in his mind, a far more deserving heir than the shaky Dauphin Charles. Charles's weapon wasn't battlefield glory, but pure, distilled treachery. In 1354, He orchestrated the assassination of Charles de la Cerda, the Constable of France and one of King John II's favourites. De la Cerda was cut down in cold blood, his body hacked to pieces in a roadside inn. It wasn't just murder, it was a declaration. The bad would not play by the old rules. But here's the twist. Instead of punishment, Charles walked away with concessions. King John, terrified of sparking further unrest, signed treaties to appease him. This only emboldened Navarre's appetite. He switched allegiances like a man changing clothes, pledging loyalty to France one day, swearing to Edward III of England the next, then cozying up to the Black Prince when it suited him. Each betrayal left the French monarchy weaker, each alliance feeding his legend as a master of chaos. He even staged prison breaks worthy of a Netflix drama. Locked away for treason, Charles of Navarre escaped more than once, using disguises, bribes, and sheer audacity. Chroniclers describe him smuggling messages in hollowed-out loaves of bread, tricking guards, and slipping through the cracks of his confinement. He was Houdini in a crown, and every escape humiliated the French monarchy further. For the Dauphin Charles, Navarre was a nightmare he couldn't kill. The bad had armies, money, and a knack for rallying malcontents to his banner. In Paris, during Etienne Marcel's revolt, Navarre was hailed as a possible saviour, the alternative king France didn't know it wanted. That he openly courted English support didn't seem to bother his followers. To them, he was a weapon against weak leadership, and that was good enough. But betrayal has an expiration date. Over the years, Charles's endless scheming alienated allies as quickly as he gained them. English leaders found him unreliable, French nobles despised his duplicity, and the Black Prince saw him as more liability than asset. He lived by intrigue, and intrigue eroded the ground beneath him. His end was as grotesque as his life. In 1387, decades after his heyday of treachery, Charles the Bad was bedridden and ill. Doctors prescribed him a bizarre treatment, swaddling his body in brandy-soaked cloth to restore warmth. One night, a servant's candle brushed too close. The bandages ignited, and Charles burned alive in his bed, screaming, writhing, and consumed by flames. It was an ending so horrific that even medieval chroniclers, rarely squeamish, recorded it with grim fascination. Charles of Navarre left behind no glory, no victories, just a trail of corpses and chaos. But his reign of intrigue nearly shattered France at its weakest moment, leaving Dauphin Charles with an impossible task: rebuild a kingdom where even allies couldn't be trusted. For most of his early career, Dauphin Charles looked like a man destined for obscurity. He was cautious, pale, even timid, a poor match for a world ruled by swords and boldness. Yet history has a habit of rewarding patience, and in France's darkest hour, his hesitation became a weapon. While rivals lunged and overreached, Charles learned to wait, to plan, to listen. By the time his father, John II, died in English captivity in 1364, Charles was ready to step into the crown. He would not be remembered as the weak heir. He would become Charles V, the Wise. The new king began by stabilizing the very thing France had been bleeding out for years: money. He reined in reckless spending, restructured taxation, and forced through reforms that gave the monarchy a reliable flow of revenue. It wasn't glamorous. There were no parades, no heroic charges, just ledgers and collectors. But in a war where mercenaries ruled the battlefield, coin was sharper than steel. Charles turned France's shattered economy into a tool of survival. He also understood something his predecessors did not. France didn't need glory. It needed order. He moved swiftly to calm Paris after the chaos of Etienne Marcel's revolt, restoring royal authority in the capital. He clipped the wings of troublesome nobles and centralized power back into his own hands. Where John II had been chivalrous to the point of folly, Charles was pragmatic. He would never return to England out of misplaced honor. He would rule with calculation, not impulse. But perhaps Charles's greatest genius was in choosing the right general. Enter Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight whose face was described as ugly as sin, but whose mind for war was unmatched. Called the General of Stone for his resilience, du Guesclin became Charles's sword arm. He had none of the glamour of the Black Prince, but he didn't need it. His gift was guerrilla war, Ambushes, skirmishes, grinding campaigns designed to wear enemies down. Du Guesclin understood that France couldn't win by hurling knights into English longbows. Instead, he turned the war into a game of attrition, a series of battles fought on French terms. One village retaken here, one fortress starved out there. Slowly, methodically, he reclaimed territory. And behind him stood Charles V, counting the coin, paying the men, and letting his general do the work. Together, king and captain forged a new kind of warfare. Gone was the reckless bravado of Crécy and Poitiers. In its place came patience, strategy, and discipline. France was no longer chasing glory, it was clawing back survival, and to the shock of Europe, it started working. By the late 1360s, the kingdom that had seemed on the brink of disintegration was finding its footing. Mercenaries were being redirected to fight abroad. Paris was no longer on the edge of rebellion. The English grip, once suffocating, began to loosen. Charles the Wise had transformed France from a corpse into a patient, weak, scarred, but breathing again. Yet while France steadied itself, the English were about to make a gamble of their own. Edward's heir, the Black Prince, would carry the war not in France but into Spain, seeking glory, allies, and plunder. And France's quiet recovery would soon be tested by fire on the plains of Nájera. If France under Charles V was beginning to recover, England was heading in the opposite direction, bled by ambition, drained by glory. The pivot point was not in Normandy or Gascony, but in Spain, where dynastic squabbles lured the Black Prince into a war that should never have been his. It was a detour drenched in blood and, more importantly, coin. The stage was Castile. King Pedro, called the Cruel, had been deposed by his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Pedro turned to England for help, promising treasure and alliances in exchange for his throne. For Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, this was irresistible. He had already forged his legend at Crécy and Poitiers, but Spain offered something even greater, the chance to act as kingmaker. He would carve his name across Europe, not just France. The French, naturally, backed the rival claimant Henry, and Charles V, ever the strategist, dispatched none other than Bertrand du Guesclin to fight in Spain. It was the perfect testing ground. English chivalry and flamboyance against French patience and grit. Two champions of their nations, meeting under a foreign sun. The clash came in 1367, at Nájera. The Black Prince commanded a disciplined, glittering army, English longbowmen, Gascon cavalry, and Pedro's ragged supporters. Du Guesclin, with his French and Castilian allies, fought ferociously but was outmaneuvered. The English victory was decisive. Du Guesclin himself was captured, though in true mercenary fashion, he cheerfully named his ransom price on the spot. "A king does not pay for me," he supposedly quipped, "but I am worth a king's ransom." On the surface, the battle seemed like another English triumph, a sequel to Crécy and Poitiers. The Black Prince had won glory. Pedro the Cruel was restored to his throne. Chroniclers marveled at English discipline and tactics, but beneath the surface, rot had set in. Spain had cost Edward more than it gave. The campaign was brutally expensive, draining the prince's treasury and forcing oppressive taxation on Aquitaine when he returned. Worse, Pedro proved a worthless ally, ungrateful, paranoid, and quickly overthrown again. All Edward had bought with English blood was a few years of instability in a kingdom that wasn't even his. Du Guesclin, meanwhile, paid his ransom, walked free, and returned to Charles V's service stronger than ever. France had lost the battle but not the war. And while the Black Prince's star dimmed, burdened by illness and financial ruin, Du Guesclin's rose higher, a stone general returned from fire. The irony was bitter. At Nájera, the Black Prince had shown himself the finest battlefield commander of his age, but it was his last true victory. Spain broke his health, his finances, and his legacy. From then on, Edward would wither, his reputation fading even as Charles V and Du Guesclin patiently rebuilt France's fortunes. By 1369, the war had entered a new phase. England, once the predator, was now overstretched. France, once the prey, was sharpening its claws again. The pendulum of fortune, long tilted against the Valois, was finally beginning to swing. By the late 1360s, France wasn't triumphant, but it was steadying. What had looked like a kingdom on the verge of disintegration was, against all expectation, knitting itself back together. The heir, once dismissed as timid, now wore the crown as Charles V, the Wise, a ruler who traded spectacle for strategy and chivalric posturing for patient calculation. The kingdom's recovery was not won in a single battle but in countless quiet victories. Du Guesclin's relentless campaigns clawed back strongholds one by one. Charles's reforms turned a shattered treasury into a weapon. Every coin stretched into steel and grain for his armies. Even Paris, once in open revolt, bent again to the crown. France was no longer dazzling, but it was steady, and in a war of endurance, steadiness was strength. England, meanwhile, stumbled beneath the weight of its own triumphs. The Black Prince's march into Spain had ended in hollow glory, draining his health and his coffers alike. Aquitaine, suffocated by new taxes, simmered with resentment. Edward III, once the scourge of France, was growing old, his conquests fraying at the edges. For the first time in a generation, the English grip on France began to loosen. What emerged from this decade was not a France reborn, but a France that refused to die. Scarred, battered, and still precarious, it had learned the value of endurance. In Charles V's hands, survival itself became a weapon, slower than arrows, less glamorous than cavalry charges, but deadlier in the long march of 100 years. The war was far from over, but for the first time, France no longer fought simply to endure, it was beginning to fight to win. France had no shortage of crowned heads, but in 1380, it lost the one thing holding the realm together: stability. Charles V, the Wise, was dead. In his place sat a boy of 11, Charles VI, too young to rule and too fragile to survive what was coming. France would not be undone by English arrows, at least, not yet. Its first torment came from within. Power-hungry uncles draining the treasury, dukes sharpening knives in Paris, and a queen whose reputation was as poisoned as her court. The throne itself became a stage for madness, betrayal, and murder. And just when it seemed France had torn itself apart, England returned to the battlefield with a king who turned mud into legend. The result? Civil war feeding foreign conquest. A kingdom bleeding from within, while its enemy carved deeper wounds from without. This was the chapter of lunacy and ambition. A mad king, a murdered duke, and Henry V, the warrior king, rising to strike France when it was weakest. The war was about to enter its bloodiest phase. When Charles V died in 1380, France lost its anchor. His decades of steady rule ended abruptly, and with him went the fragile balance that had kept the kingdom afloat. His death left a throne that seemed secure, but his heir was only 11. That boy, Charles VI, was placed on a gilded seat, surrounded not by loyal servants but by wolves in velvet robes. The uncles of the new king, Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon, rushed to seize the regency like bankers diving on unguarded gold. They wrapped themselves in the language of guardianship, claiming they acted in the child's best interest. In truth, they were carving up France as though it were a banquet. Taxes were eased, not out of compassion, but to curry favor and enrich themselves. The treasury Charles V had so carefully rebuilt was squandered as if prudence had been buried with him. Anjou, the most brazen of the pack, even tried to finance his own private conquest in Italy using French resources. Imagine a modern CEO looting company funds to buy himself a villa in Tuscany while the firm teetered on bankruptcy. That was the Valois Regency. The common people saw through it, and soon Paris seethed with resentment. What good was a boy king if he could not protect his subjects from his own family? The countryside echoed with anger. Peasant uprisings and urban riots flared, driven by frustration at taxes, corruption, and constant instability. To those living under the Valois crown, it seemed the monarchy was no longer a shield, but a parasite. Chroniclers noted how Charles VI's coronation, usually a moment of majesty, had been overshadowed by public unrest. The fragile stability Charles V had secured now unraveled, leaving France adrift once more. When Charles VI came of age in 1388, hope briefly returned. He dismissed his predatory uncles and recalled the loyal ministers of his father, the so-called marmosets. These men were experienced, disciplined, and far more interested in governance than plunder. For a few years, the realm breathed easier. Taxes stabilized, corruption lessened, and even the English threat seemed manageable. For a fleeting moment, France remembered what good rule felt like. But power attracts envy like meat draws flies. The uncles did not intend to watch their influence slip away. They whispered in shadows, cultivated allies, and spread doubts about the king's advisors. A young monarch could be guided or manipulated, and Charles VI was no Edward III, no iron-willed prodigy. He was clever enough to govern, but not strong enough to resist the constant pull of factional politics. Even in these years of relative calm, cracks were forming in the foundations of his rule. Rivalries simmered not just between the crown and the nobility, but within the royal family itself. Burgundy, the wealthiest of the ducal houses thanks to Flemish trade, grew ever more powerful. Paris itself was beginning to tilt toward Burgundian influence, while other nobles resented the imbalance. The outlines of civil fracture were already visible at the kingdom's core, waiting only for a spark to tear them open. And that moment was not far off. The fragile peace depended on Charles VI himself, the boy who had become a king. But kings are not marble statues. They bleed, they falter, they break. In 1392, the young monarch would suffer a collapse so sudden, so violent, that the entire realm was left staring at its own doom. France had survived bad kings before. What it had never endured was a king who lost his mind. The wolves had been kept at bay for now, but the scent of weakness was in the air, and they were sharpening their teeth. In the summer of 1392, the Kingdom of France discovered what it meant to be ruled by a mind unraveling. Charles VI rode at the head of his knights, a glittering procession meant to punish a rebellious noble in Brittany. It should have been routine, a flex of royal muscle, the kind of campaign kings cut their teeth on. Instead, the king suddenly turned on his own men. Sword in hand, eyes wild, he butchered his companions in a frenzy before being restrained. France had seen kings die in battle, kings betrayed, even kings humiliated, but never one who forgot who he was in the saddle. This was no passing fit. The breakdowns kept coming. At times, Charles failed to recognize his own name, his wife, even his crown. He drifted into spells of paranoia, convinced assassins lurked in every corner. Once, he refused to bathe because he was certain he was made of glass and might shatter. A monarch is supposed to embody stability, but here was a king who might forget what day it was before breakfast. France was being ruled by a man unmoored from himself. In his absence, power fell to those closest to him, most dangerously, to Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She was young, foreign, and soon infamous. Rumors swirled of extravagance, corruption, and affairs with powerful men, even her own brother-in-law, Louis of Orléans. To the common people, Isabeau became a symbol of vice, the scandalous empress of a court drenched in decadence. Chroniclers painted her as France's Jezebel, though some of that venom may have been the product of propaganda. What mattered was perception. A mad king and a corrupt queen made for a monarchy that looked more like a farce than a foundation. The dukes circled again, Burgundy, Orléans, and Berry, this time not as regents of a boy, but as rivals exploiting a broken man. The realm became a chessboard of bloodkin, every move sharpening the blade for civil war. To govern France meant to control the person of the king, and Charles became less a ruler than a prize to be fought over. His illness was not just a tragedy, it was political fuel, and the longer it dragged on, the more vicious the struggle became. For ordinary people, the spectacle was horrifying. France was still recovering from war, famine, and plague, yet the nobility seemed intent on treating the crown like a toy. Soldiers went unpaid, garrisons stood hollow, and whole regions slid into the grip of banditry masquerading as lordship. The people saw madness above and lawlessness below, a kingdom collapsing inward, the bond between monarch and subject fraying to threads. At first, there were whispers of sympathy for Charles VI. Chroniclers spoke of him as the beloved, a man struck by a cruel fate, but pity turned to frustration as the years dragged on. Each relapse sent the kingdom lurching into crisis. Each recovery brought false hope, soon dashed by another collapse. A monarchy built on divine right was now ruled by chance, by the roll of invisible dice inside the king's skull. The real consequence was paralysis. Every time Charles lost his grip, France lost its head. Advisors shifted, factions swapped power, and no policy could endure longer than the king's lucidity. Rival dukes amassed their own private armies, their own networks of loyalty, preparing for the inevitable, that one day the crown's authority would crumble entirely. In a world where the king was the state, what happened when the monarch turned into an empty vessel, present in body, absent in rule? This was more than illness. It was contagion. Madness at the top infected the body politic, eroding trust, fueling suspicion, and feeding ambition. France was not at war with England at this moment. It was at war with itself, waiting for the knife in the dark. And soon, one of those knives would find its mark. Because in 1407, the simmering rivalries around the throne would erupt in murder, and that murder would split France in two. Paris, the 23rd of November, 1407. The city streets were slick with rain, the kind of night when shadows stretched long and whispers carried far. Louis of Orléans, brother of the king, rode home after visiting Queen Isabeau. He never made it. As he passed under a torchlit arch, assassins leapt from the dark. They hacked him from his horse and left his body sprawled on the cobblestones. In the morning, Parisians awoke to find a royal duke butchered in the gutter like a common thief. Behind the murder stood John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, and fear had little to do with him. He ordered the killing not in secrecy, but with a sense of grim righteousness. Within weeks he confessed openly, justifying the assassination as an act of patriotic duty. Louis of Orléans, he claimed, was a tyrant in waiting, a corrupter of the Queen, a danger to France. It was not murder, he insisted. It was justice, a single blade severing corruption before it poisoned the crown entirely. But France did not see it that way. What John unleashed was no cleansing. It was contagion. Paris itself divided almost overnight. Supporters of Burgundy hailed him as a savior, a man who dared to act where others cowered. Supporters of Orléans, who now rallied around his young son Charles, cried vengeance. They took the name Armagnacs, borrowing it from one of their chief allies, Count Bernard of Armagnac. Thus France became a two-headed beast. Armagnacs against Burgundians, each claiming to serve the king, each sharpening blades against fellow Frenchmen. The king himself, Charles VI, drifted in and out of madness, too fragile to intervene. His throne, even his person, became little more than a pawn, fought over, traded, and paraded as a token of power. Isabeau of Bavaria, ever pragmatic, shifted allegiances as survival demanded. To the people of Paris, it must have felt as though the monarchy had dissolved into a pit fight, the crown traded like a trinket between predators. The consequences spread beyond Paris. Armagnac and Burgundian armies roamed the countryside, pillaging as though fighting a foreign war. Cities declared allegiance to one faction or the other, and neighbors became enemies overnight. Monasteries recorded the chaos in despairing tones. Brother slays brother, and the realm tears its own heart to pieces. What the English longed to accomplish with arrows and sieges, the French nobility were managing with daggers and arrogance. The Parisian streets became a theatre of factional violence. Murders, lynchings, and riots punctuated daily life. The Burgundians held sway for much of the capital, but the Armagnacs were never far away. Every rumour, every insult, every whisper of conspiracy could spark bloodshed. Imagine living under a regime where your choice of tavern could mark you as Armagnac or Burgundian. That was the reality of a kingdom at war with itself. For John the Fearless, the gamble paid off for a while. He became the power behind the throne, his influence in Paris unrivaled. But his boldness had also painted a target on his back. The Armagnacs swore vengeance for the murder of Orléans, and their hatred festered for over a decade. The blood spilled in 1407 was not washed away by rain. It had soaked into the very stones of Paris, and it would be repaid in kind. The 100 Years' War had begun as a struggle with England, but by 1410 it resembled a grotesque play staged on French soil. Armagnacs and Burgundians battling for the crown while the enemy waited in the wings. And while the kingdom tore itself apart, England quietly sharpened its sword, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Because across the Channel, a new king was rising, one who would see opportunity in France's madness, one who would make mud itself a weapon. His name was Henry V. The murder of Louis of Orléans had set the kingdom ablaze, and yet for a time John the Fearless emerged not as a fugitive but as master of Paris. He had wealth behind him, drawn from the bustling cities of Flanders, where cloth and trade fattened Burgundian coffers. He had popular support among Parisians, who despised the heavy taxes levied by the Armagnac faction. And most dangerously, he had the loyalty of a battle-hardened militia willing to spill blood in the name of their duke. In a kingdom without a functioning king, that made John the Fearless more than just a noble. It made him the ruler of the streets. The Armagnacs, however, refused to bow. They rallied around the son of the murdered Duke of Orléans and Bernard of Armagnac, vowing vengeance. The civil war deepened into cycles of brutal reprisals. Each victory brought slaughter, each truce disintegrated into renewed violence. France's nobility wasn't just divided, it was tearing the kingdom apart piece by piece, as if every feud demanded a ransom in blood. And like vultures circling overhead, the English watched with interest. Every French sword turned against another was one less raised in defense of the kingdom. Paris suffered the most. The city swung like a pendulum between factions. When the Burgundians held it, Armagnac partisans were dragged from their homes and butchered in the streets. When the Armagnacs seized control, the roles reversed. By 1418, the massacre of Paris left thousands dead, their only crime being allegiance to the wrong side of the feud. Imagine trying to live a normal life in a city where your last name or the badge on your cloak could sign your death warrant. John the Fearless played the long game. He presented himself as the savior of France, the only man capable of restoring stability, while the king languished in madness. To many Parisians, he seemed preferable to the extravagance of the Armagnacs and the hated Isabeau. But John's ambition was too naked, too ruthless. For the Dauphin Charles, the young heir to the throne, Burgundy was less a savior than a rival who threatened to eclipse him completely. The tension snapped in 1419 at the Bridge of Montereau. John the Fearless met with the Dauphin to negotiate peace, each side swearing safety under truce. But peace was a word already poisoned in France. As the two parties faced one another, tempers flared, blades flashed, and John the Fearless was cut down on the spot. The Duke who had ruled Paris through murder was himself struck down at the negotiating table, his blood soaking into the bridge that was meant to bear the weight of peace. It was a killing that echoed louder than Orléans' death. For one, it was a direct betrayal of safe conduct, a violation of one of the few remaining sacred codes in a world of endless treachery. For another, it drove Burgundy out of France's fragile coalition forever. John's son, Philip the Good, inherited not just a duchy, but a blood feud, and he knew exactly where to find allies strong enough to avenge his father. Those allies lay across the Channel. In 1419, Philip the Good turned to England. He offered not just troops and coin, but legitimacy, a partnership that would divide France in two, Armagnacs on one side, Burgundians and English on the other. The murder of John the Fearless reshaped the 100 Years' War. No longer two crowns in conflict, it had become a three-sided struggle. France split into rival camps, its unity shattered into shards too jagged to mend. For the English, this was the dream scenario. For France, it was the beginning of nightmare upon nightmare, because Henry V, England's warrior king, had just found the perfect opening, and he would waste no time in striking at the kingdom's exposed core. In 1413, England gained a king unlike any it had seen in generations. Henry V was no frivolous monarch draped in velvet and jewels. He was lean, disciplined, and pious to the point of severity. Chroniclers wrote of him as a man who rose before dawn to pray, who drank sparingly, and who punished even his closest friends if they strayed from order. England had been scarred by rebellion during his father's reign, but Henry began his rule with a singular obsession: to forge his divided realm into unity, and then turn that unity into a weapon aimed at France. France, meanwhile, was a gift-wrapped target. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were too busy slaughtering each other to resist an invasion. The king was mad, the Dauphin discredited, and Paris a playground for factions. Henry could not have asked for a more perfect opening. He revived Edward III's claim to the French throne, presenting himself not just as an invader, but as the rightful heir. It was clever politics, cloaking conquest as justice. The sword of God, Henry implied, was in his hand. In 1415, Henry launched his campaign with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it for years. His target was Harfleur, a port city in Normandy. The siege dragged on for weeks, sapping English strength, but the city eventually fell. Victory was his, but disease had already thinned his army. Weakened and outnumbered, Henry should have retreated home. Instead, he marched eastward, daring the French to stop him. He wanted more than land. He wanted spectacle. That spectacle came at Agincourt, the 25th of October, 1415. The French nobility gathered in glittering ranks, their banners flying, confident they would crush the exhausted invaders. They had numbers on their side, perhaps 4-1, but confidence turned to catastrophe. The French knights charged through mud made slick by autumn rain, only to meet a wall of English longbowmen. Arrows hissed in endless volleys, horses screamed, and the chivalry of France sank into the mire. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse, with French nobles trampled, drowned, and butchered in heaps. The shock was immense. The flower of French knighthood, slain not in heroic duels, but in the filth of a muddy field. To Henry, it was providence. To France, humiliation layered upon humiliation. Chroniclers groped for comparisons, but Agincourt felt crueler than anything before, less a battle than a massacre in mud. Even the prisoners fared badly. Henry, fearing counterattack, ordered many of them executed on the spot. Mercy had no place in his brand of kingship. From that day, Henry was not just a king, he was a legend. His reputation thundered across Europe. Normandy fell next, not in a blaze of charges, but through systematic sieges. Town by town, fortress by fortress, Henry choked France's northern lifeline. Where earlier English kings had raided and burned, Henry occupied and governed. Normandy became less a battleground than an annexed province, ruled with efficiency and ruthless order. The Dauphin Charles, discredited and sidelined, could not mount effective resistance. The Armagnacs lacked unity, the Burgundians had aligned with England, and Paris itself was hostile. France had never looked weaker. The Valois dynasty, once the proud house of Capetian kings, now drifted like a dynasty in exile within its own kingdom. But Henry was not content with Normandy. He wanted more. He wanted legitimacy, permanence, a throne that could not be wrested away by rebellion or revolt. And in 1420, he would get it, through a treaty that disinherited the Dauphin and made him heir to France itself. Because Henry V was not just fighting battles, he was preparing to rewrite the map of Europe. By 1420, France was less a kingdom than a battlefield picked clean, its pieces fought over by predators. The Armagnacs held scraps of loyalty in the south, the Burgundians commanded Paris, and Henry V dominated Normandy. What passed for a monarchy in Paris was little more than a sickroom court, presided over by Charles VI, a king who no longer knew when he was king. Into this vacuum stepped Henry, not as a conqueror, but as a savior with a quill. The Treaty of Troyes was the most humiliating diplomatic surrender in France's history. Charles VI, under Burgundian influence and mental collapse, signed away the future of his dynasty. His daughter, Catherine of Valois, was married to Henry V, sealing the alliance. The Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir by blood, was disinherited, branded a rebel unworthy of the crown. Instead, Henry was named regent of France and heir to the throne. Two crowns, England and France, would be united upon his head. To contemporaries, it looked as though the Valois line had been erased in ink. The symbolism was staggering. When Henry and Catherine processed through Paris, they were hailed as the future of France. The Burgundians cheered, their alliance vindicated, while the Armagnacs seethed in exile. For England, it seemed as though the 100 Years' War had achieved its ultimate goal, a dual monarchy spanning the Channel. What Edward III had claimed, what the Black Prince had fought for, Henry V had won, and he had done so with both sword and marriage bed. But treaties do not end wars, they merely shift the battleground. The Dauphin Charles, stripped of legitimacy, retreated south. Though branded a usurper, he still commanded loyalty in the Loire Valley. His supporters whispered that the treaty was a sham, signed by a mad king and a desperate queen. To them, Henry was not heir but foreign occupier, a wolf draped in coronation robes. France, though broken and divided, had not yet surrendered its soul. Meanwhile, Henry pressed his advantage with tireless energy. He pursued campaigns to consolidate Normandy and enforce his authority, ensuring no French city could deny him. He seemed invincible, victorious in war, shrewd in politics, adored by his men, feared by his enemies. Chroniclers likened him to conquerors of old, a warrior whose victories seemed touched by divine favor. Even the Burgundians, who had allied out of vengeance, began to see Henry as a king who might genuinely bring stability. Yet beneath the triumph was a shadow. France was not conquered in spirit, only in law. The Dauphin waited, bitter but not broken. The people grumbled under English taxes and garrisons. And Henry himself was mortal, though he fought as if time could not touch him. Triumph had made him heir to France, but fate was sharpening its own blade. In 1422, with the crown of two kingdoms finally within his grasp, Henry fell ill. A sudden fever gripped him, wasting the warrior king before his armies, before his child, before his treaty could truly bear fruit. At the height of his power, Henry V died at the age of 35. He left behind an infant son, Henry VI, barely 9 months old, to inherit both crowns. The king who had broken France with mud, arrows, and ink was gone, and now a baby would be expected to hold together the spoils of his triumph. By 1422, the 100 Years' War seemed won, not by France, but by England. The Treaty of Troyes had stripped the Valois of legitimacy. Burgundy stood as England's eager ally, and Henry V's victories gave him the aura of a man chosen by God. France was no longer a realm fighting an enemy across the Channel. It was a kingdom carved in two, half under foreign banners, half prey to its feuding lords. And yet, within months of triumph, it all collapsed. Henry V was dead, Charles VI followed soon after, and the two crowns passed not to a seasoned ruler but to a child still in his cradle. England had won the war on parchment, but in practice it had inherited a problem too vast for an infant king to solve. The dual monarchy was less a foundation than a fragile dream, already buckling beneath its own impossible weight. France, meanwhile, though beaten and humiliated, was not erased. The Dauphin still clung to life in the south, his court mocked as the King of Bourges. The people still whispered of their true line, their true king, and their true nation. And even in ruin, the memory of what France had been smouldered quietly, waiting for the chance to ignite again. This chapter of the war closes not with resolution, but with a realm still split apart. France was split, England overextended, Burgundy entrenched, and the future uncertain. The war had entered its darkest chapter yet, but history was not finished with either kingdom. What followed would not be triumph but rebirth, not certainty but miracle. The war had burned for nearly a century, and yet the crown of France fell not to a hardened warrior, but to a child who couldn't yet speak. Henry VI, less than a year old, was suddenly King of England and France, the miracle heir of Henry V's conquests and the Treaty of Troyes. His was a reign of rattles and regents, and from the moment he wailed in the cradle, the question was clear: who really ruled in his name? Across the Loire, another king, older but mocked as timid and powerless, waited in exile. Charles VII, dismissed by many as a phantom king, had been written off by his enemies as a joke, the so-called King of Bourges, a man with a crown but no kingdom. His court was thin, his treasuries thinner, and his hopes as brittle as the seals and signatures that barely held his supporters in line. France, to all appearances, belonged to the English. But history has a way of turning on the most unlikely figures, and here, against the backdrop of sieges, civil war, and dynasties unraveling, walked a barefoot teenager from a provincial village, Joan of Arc. She carried no sword at first, no title, no authority, only the conviction that God had spoken to her and that she was destined to drive the English out. This is the decade where the 100 Years' War twisted upon its axis, where dynasties faltered, faith became a weapon, and a peasant girl would stand against the might of kings. The English thought they had already won. They were wrong. Henry VI entered the world as both the most powerful baby in Christendom and its most vulnerable. His father, Henry V, had carved his way into legend at Agincourt and bent France to his will with the Treaty of Troyes. His mother, Catherine of Valois, was the daughter of a French king. On paper, the child had united England and France into a single monarchy. In reality, he inherited a throne far too heavy for a child. At his coronation, attendants had to steady him on the dais. The problem wasn't just that the king was a baby, it was that everyone wanted to speak for him. In France, his uncle John, Duke of Bedford, became regent. Bedford was steady, pragmatic, and ruthless enough to keep the English war machine grinding forward. In England, the role of protector fell to another uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Humphrey was ambitious, quarrelsome, and about as subtle as a tavern brawl. Between them stretched not only the Channel, but the growing fault lines in the so-called dual monarchy. Hovering in the background was another figure, Richard, Duke of York. At this stage he was young, not yet the man whose name would ignite the Wars of the Roses. But his lineage and his ambitions made him dangerous. Everyone knew that if Henry VI faltered, if this frail child king failed to live up to his father's legacy, men like Richard would be waiting to step forward. The monarchy was less a throne and more a game of musical chairs, and the music was only just beginning. While regents argued and nobles schemed, the war ground on. The English still held vast swaths of France, from Paris in the north to Normandy along the coast. But holding territory required money, men, and morale, all of which were stretched thin. Every garrison demanded pay. Every siege drained the treasury. And back in England, where taxes were rising and fields lay exhausted, the common people grumbled. The glory of Henry V's victories had curdled into the bitterness of his son's burden. The French countryside still reeled from decades of war. Armies stripped fields bare and left charred villages in their wake, as though the land itself were the true casualty. English soldiers cursed their dwindling wages, while French peasants cursed both crowns in equal measure. To many, it seemed the 100 Years' War wasn't about kings at all, but about whose boots trampled their fields and whose coffers swallowed their labour. And yet, for all its fragility, the English Empire in France looked solid in the 1,420 seconds. Bedford was a competent regent, the Burgundian alliance remained intact, and the Dauphin Charles was a weak rival in exile. The English had the boy with two crowns, a symbol of inevitability, a living reminder that France had been conquered. But symbols can fade, and crowns can slip. The real danger wasn't visible yet, but it was coming, because in the shadows, the disinherited prince was not as powerless as he appeared, and history has a way of waiting for the right voice to call the faithful back. If Henry VI was the child with two crowns, Charles VII was the man with none. Mocked as the Roi de Bourges, the King of Bourges, he ruled only the southern fragments of France, a scattering of towns and impoverished provinces, holding to him more out of routine than conviction. His father had been a mad king. His mother, Queen Isabeau, was widely despised and accused of betraying France by signing away his inheritance in the Treaty of Troyes. And his rivals had painted him not just as weak, but illegitimate. For many, Charles wasn't even a king. He was an inconvenience. His court in Bourges was a portrait of diminished royalty. No glittering Parisian palaces, no overflowing treasuries. Instead, threadbare nobility who hadn't defected to Burgundy or England, clerks scraping together coin, and soldiers trying to hold the Loire Valley against the English advance. Chroniclers describe Charles as indecisive, hesitant to commit to battle, often preferring negotiation to open war. To his critics, that made him cowardly. To his supporters, it made him cautious, a king who understood that gambling with what little he had left might doom France entirely. Yet his perceived weakness carried an unexpected advantage. Charles became something his father never was, approachable. He laughed easily, showed kindness to servants, and listened, sometimes too much, to his advisors. In a kingdom where kings often drowned in arrogance, his humility was both a flaw and a quiet strength. Those around him began to see not just a man in exile, but a monarch who might, one day, rise again if given the chance. But chance, in the 1,420 seconds, seemed unlikely. The English war machine loomed. With Paris and northern France under their control, Bedford's forces pressed deeper south, tightening the noose. Burgundy, under Duke Philip the Good, stood firmly allied to England, ensuring that Charles was hemmed in by enemies on every side. Burgundy's wealth, drawn from Flemish cities like Bruges and Ghent, gave the Anglo-Burgundian alliance both resources and prestige. Against this coalition, Charles had little to offer but promises and dwindling faith. At court, factions jostled for influence. Some urged him to launch bold campaigns to reclaim lost lands. Others whispered that he should sue for peace, even if it meant giving up the French crown entirely. Charles vacillated, worn thin by the weight of impossible choices. Every delay, every missed opportunity, fed the sneers of those who called him the do-nothing king. And still the English advanced, slowly but relentlessly. But here is the irony of history. Sometimes survival itself is victory. Charles did not collapse. He did not flee to Spain, nor renounce his claim, nor die in some petty skirmish. Against all odds, he endured. Bourges remained his capital, his court a stubborn flicker of legitimacy in the surrounding darkness. And endurance, when paired with patience, can become a weapon. Because while Charles clung to life in exile, something extraordinary was stirring far from Bourges, not in a palace, but in a village field. A girl was listening to voices she believed came from heaven, and she would change everything. Domremy was no Paris, no Bourges, not even a proper town. It was a speck of a village on the borderlands, where French and Burgundian raids left farmhouses in ashes and fields churned into wastelands. Out of this ordinary mud and misery came an extraordinary claim that a teenage peasant girl named Jeanne, daughter of Jacques the farmer and Isabel the devout mother, had been chosen by heaven itself to save France. She said she heard voices. Saints, she insisted. Catherine, Margaret, and Michael the Archangel. They had given her a mission: drive out the English and crown the Dauphin as the true king. The timing was perfect, or insane, depending on whom you asked. France was suffocating under despair. Charles VII looked more like a fugitive than a monarch. His supporters fragmented, his enemies confident. Into this vacuum walked a girl not yet 20, claiming she was God's answer to France's suffering. Chroniclers differ on the first impression she made. Some describe her as radiant and unwavering, others as awkward and rustic. But what no one disputed was her conviction. In an age where kings hesitated and generals quarreled, Joan spoke with terrifying certainty. At first, she was dismissed outright. Who would listen to a peasant girl in men's clothes claiming divine visions? But word spread. She spoke with such clarity, such burning faith, that priests, soldiers, and townsfolk began to believe. Miracles were whispered, that she could recognize the Dauphin in disguise, that she could predict the outcome of battles. Whether true or embroidered, the stories grew, and with them, her legend. Desperation made fertile ground, and Joan planted hope where none had been. Her path to Charles VII was no easy ride. She had to convince local lords to grant her safe passage, endure interrogations from churchmen suspicious of heresy, and pass the relentless scrutiny of advisors who saw her as either a savior or a dangerous fraud. Yet with each trial, she stood firm. Not educated, not trained in arms, but immovable in her belief. In a France paralyzed by doubt, that alone was power. When Joan finally met Charles VII, the encounter became legend. Some say he tested her by hiding among his courtiers, and she picked him out instantly. Others claim she revealed secret prayers only he had spoken. Whatever happened, Charles, the hesitant, ridiculed Dauphin listened. More than that, he believed. Against every instinct of politics, against the sneers of his advisors, he gave this teenage peasant girl an audience, and then a role. But Joan was not content to bless banners or sing hymns. She demanded action. She told Charles that God willed him to be crowned at Reims, the traditional coronation site deep in enemy territory. But first, Orléans must be saved. The city had been under English siege for months, its fall certain. If Orléans fell, France might die with it. If it held, France might yet endure. And so, with nothing but voices in her head and a banner in her hand, Joan of Arc prepared to step into the pages of history. The siege of Orléans was the slow suffocation of a city. Since 1428, the English had ringed it with forts and barricades, cutting off trade, supplies, and morale. The Loire River was choked with blockades, the people within starving and afraid. To the English, this was routine. Another fortress falling, another step toward crushing Charles VII for good. To the French, Orléans was more than stone and walls. It was a symbol. If it fell, so too might the last flicker of France's resistance. Enter Joan of Arc. Dressed in armor, riding a white horse, and carrying a banner instead of a sword, she became a living emblem of hope. Chroniclers describe her riding into Orléans on the 29th of April, the 1429, the crowds cheering as though salvation itself had arrived. Soldiers who had been resigned to defeat suddenly found themselves roaring with zeal. A teenage girl had done what no prince, no general, no nobleman had achieved in years. She gave the French something to believe in. Command was not formally hers. Men like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, still directed the strategy, but her influence was undeniable. She urged assaults where others hesitated, demanded bold action when the commanders counseled caution, and against all odds, it worked. French troops, electrified by her presence, stormed the English positions one by one. The siege lines that had seemed impregnable collapsed under renewed fury. On May 7, during a furious assault, Joan was struck by an arrow. Witnesses claimed she pulled it out herself, refusing to retreat and return to the fray. The sight of her rallying the men, bleeding but unbroken, became the stuff of instant legend. By the next day, the English abandoned the siege and retreated. Orléans was free. The psychological impact was seismic. For years, the French had lived under the weight of defeat, their monarchy a joke, their armies scattered. Now, a teenage girl had shattered the English aura of inevitability. Whispers of divine favor spread through the countryside. God was with France again. Even the skeptical could not deny the results. The Dauphin, the so-called King of Bourges, had suddenly acquired something he'd lacked for a decade: momentum. Joan pressed the advantage. She insisted Charles march north to Reims, deep in enemy-held territory, for his coronation. Advisors balked. It was madness to march straight into danger. Yet Joan's conviction bulldozed doubt, and in July 1429, Charles VII entered Reims, the cathedral echoing with the chants of his anointing. At last, he was king, not just by claim, but by sacred right. The king once mocked as crownless now wore one at last, and the English, for the first time since Agincourt, realized that their grip on France was slipping. Joan had not only saved a city, she had resurrected a nation. Victory is a fickle ally. Joan of Arc had turned the tide at Orléans, carried Charles VII to his coronation, and breathed life back into a monarchy on its knees. But glory is dangerous, and for Joan, it painted a target on her back. In 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, she rode once more at the head of her men. This time, her luck broke. Surrounded by Burgundian forces, she was dragged from her horse and taken captive. No divine voices intervened. No miracle spared her. The Burgundians, pragmatic as ever, saw profit in their prize. They sold her to the English, who now held their long-awaited weapon, the chance to break not just a girl, but the myth she embodied. She was transferred to Rouen, placed under guard, and subjected to interrogation. To her captors, Joan was not merely a soldier, she was a dangerous idea. If God truly favored her, then God was against them. That they could not allow. The trial that followed was less about justice and more about demolition. Churchmen loyal to England crafted charges designed to strip away her claim. Heresy, witchcraft, false visions, and absurdly but damningly, the crime of wearing men's clothing. Behind the pretense of procedure was fear. If Joan was right, then England's cause was doomed. If Joan was wrong, she had to be exposed, humiliated, and silenced forever. Joan, barely 19, faced her inquisitors with a defiance that shook even her enemies. She outmaneuvered theologians in argument, parried their traps with wit, and clung to her claim that her voices were real, her mission divine. Her words were simple, but her resolve was steel. Chroniclers noted her composure in the courtroom as sharply as others had noted her ferocity on the battlefield. And yet, bravery did not spare her. Condemned as a heretic, Joan was led to the stake in Rouen on the 30th of May, 1431. The square filled with crowds, soldiers, clergy, commoners, some jeering, some weeping. Tied to the pyre, she asked for a cross, and a sympathetic English soldier fashioned one from sticks and handed it to her. As the flames rose, she cried out the name of Jesus, until her voice was swallowed by fire. At 19, the Maid of Orléans was ashes. Her execution was meant to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her. To the English, she was a witch destroyed. To the French, she became a martyr, her death proof that God had indeed chosen her. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine, but her conviction that France could live again had already spread beyond the reach of any river. The English had burned her body, but in doing so, they sparked a legacy they could never extinguish. Joan of Arc's ashes drifted on the Seine, carried away as if history itself wished to scatter her memory. The English had silenced her body, but they could not silence what she represented. For a decade, France had been mocked, its king dismissed, its people beaten down. Joan's brief blaze of faith had shown them another truth: that defeat was not destiny, that a throne abandoned could still be reclaimed. Charles VII, once derided as the King of Bourges, now wore the anointed crown of France. He had not won it by sword alone, but by the will of a peasant girl who believed more fiercely than any prince. Her courage gave him authority. Her death gave him a martyr's cause to rally behind. The Dauphin no longer looked like a fugitive. He looked like a king worth fighting for. For the English, Joan's pyre was meant to be an ending. Instead, it was a beginning of loss. Their armies still held Paris, Normandy, and much of France, but the certainty of victory had burned away with her, and without certainty, empires begin to crumble. France had found its voice in a farm girl, and though her story ended in flames, the war she reignited was only just beginning to turn. The tide had shifted, and England, whether it knew it or not, was already starting to drown. The smoke of Rouen had faded, but Joan's death refused to vanish with it. Burned as a heretic, remembered as a martyr, she left behind not silence but a spark, one that refused to die. France had been a kingdom mocked, but now it began to mock back. Charles VII, once derided as the King of Bourges, finally began to look the part of a monarch. Joan had given him a coronation. Her memory gave him a spine. Nobles who once sneered at his threadbare court came shuffling back, suddenly draped in patriotism the moment it padded their purses. Even merchants, those eternal weather vanes of profit, started wagering that France might not sink after all. Across the Channel, England clung to its dual monarchy, which in practice meant a king with two crowns and no idea what to do with either. Henry VI carried titles grander than Charlemagne, but his kingdom was run like a tavern brawl in velvet, dukes clawing at each other while the treasury bled out and unpaid soldiers eyed the exits. This was the pivot. From Joan's pyre to Charles's reconstruction, from English dominance to English disintegration. And the war's last act would not be staged with gallant charges, but with gunpowder, ledgers, and the slow unravelling of an empire stretched past breaking. Charles VII had the great fortune of being underestimated. For years, he was the Dauphin nobody wanted, the King of Bourges, presiding over a rump court with less credibility than a bankrupt tavern. But after Joan's death, something shifted. He learned the art of patience, and patience, as it turned out, could rebuild kingdoms. First came loyalty, or rather, the purchasing of it. Charles dangled favours, pensions, and privileges like bait, and the French nobility, who had spent decades chasing English gold, suddenly remembered they were French after all. A standing army would come later, but for now, he patched the splintered shell of monarchy with sheer bribery and survival instinct. Then came money. Medieval kings often begged their estates for cash, but Charles VII had the audacity to make taxation permanent. The taille, once an emergency levy, became a steady drip into the royal coffers. Nobles grumbled, peasants wept, but the war machine had found its fuel line. France, long starved of resources, now had a reliable stream of coin, and coin, not chivalry, would win the war. With cash secured, Charles forged a weapon that made even the Black Prince look like a relic, a professional army. No more begging knights to turn up between hunting trips. No more mercenaries switching sides like football fans. France now had paid companies under royal command, drilled, disciplined, and loyal to the crown's purse instead of their own whims. This was not glory. This was bureaucracy sharpened into a spear. Jean Bureau, the artillery master, thrived in this new order. He and his brother Gaspard became the architects of France's gunpowder revolution, turning Charles's coin into thunder on the battlefield. While England clung to its longbows like a bad family heirloom, France invested in cannon, machines that could knock down stone walls faster than knights could repair their pride. But Charles's genius wasn't brilliance, it was endurance. He didn't outthink England so much as wait for it to collapse under the weight of its own delusions. Where Henry V had been a lion, Henry VI was a lost lamb. Every year Charles survived, England bled. Every fortress retaken wasn't just a victory, it was England's humiliation. And humiliation became policy. Charles's restoration of authority wasn't just about land and armies. It was about narrative. He pushed the image of France reborn from ruin, guided by God's will, sanctified by Joan's sacrifice. It was propaganda wrapped in piety, and it worked. The English were no longer conquerors. They were foreign occupiers, overstaying their welcome. The French court, once the butt of Europe's jokes, began to transform into something resembling stability. Charles, who had once hid from responsibility, was now Charles the Victorious in the making. His court still whispered about his hesitations, his paranoia, his love of mistresses, but compared to England's pageant of incompetence, he looked like Augustus reborn. It was a cruel irony. The Dauphin mocked for weakness had become the king who institutionalized strength. England had its longbow legends and Shakespearean speeches. France had tax receipts, payrolls, and cannon crews. Guess which one would decide the future? Because Charles VII hadn't just restored authority, he had reinvented it. The Valois monarchy, once dangling by a thread, now rested on coin, cannon, and calculation. And England, still swinging its sword at ghosts, had no idea the ground beneath it was already giving way. The knight had been the poster child of medieval war for centuries, plate armor gleaming, lance lowered, galloping into glory, or at least into mud. But by the 1,430 seconds, he was about as useful as a fax machine in a Wi-Fi age. The real future of war came in iron, powder, and smoke, and Charles VII had just the men to wield it. Enter Jean Bureau and his brother Gaspard, accountants with cannons. They weren't dashing chevaliers. They were logistics nerds with an obsession for angles, barrels, and ammunition. Where knights measured honor in broken lances, the bureaus measured firepower in pounds of shot. And unlike the nobles, their math always added up. The shift was brutal and obvious. Stone castles, once impregnable, started to crumble like mud walls in a storm. A wall that had taken decades to build could be reduced to rubble in a week of concentrated bombardment. The very symbols of feudal defiance, towers, moats, crenellations, became quaint targets for Bureau's gunners. And it wasn't just walls. English armies, drilled in the cult of the longbow, suddenly found themselves outranged, outpowered, and outmaneuvered. At Crécy and Agincourt, English arrows had shredded charging knights. But arrows bounce off stone, cannonballs don't. The battlefield hierarchy was being rewritten, and England was stuck clinging to the wrong era. Charles VII leaned into this revolution with gusto. His permanent taxes meant he could fund permanent artillery parks. Siege warfare, once a grueling test of starvation and stubbornness, turned into a demolition job. If you were an English garrison commander watching Bureau's men roll up their gunpowder trains, you weren't planning a valiant defense. You were calculating how long before your walls collapsed, and your head followed. The impact went beyond strategy. It rewired psychology. Towns that might once have resisted for months now surrendered after the first cannonade. Why starve inside crumbling walls when you could cut a deal and save your skin? The fear of artillery traveled faster than the artillery itself. The French weren't just winning battles, they were rewriting expectations of survival. Meanwhile, England still treated gunpowder like a novelty sideshow. Yes, they had cannons, but their commanders clung to the longbow as if it were a national identity card. And while the longbow was terrifying against flesh, it was utterly useless against the French future, gunpowder-backed monarchy. The irony was delicious. England, once the innovator of medieval slaughter, had become conservative, clinging to yesterday's weapon. France, mocked for incompetence, had embraced tomorrow's. Knights had always been expensive luxuries, draining coffers and dying spectacularly. Cannons were expensive too, but they earned their keep. One well-placed shot could do more than 1,000 lances. Gunpowder didn't just win sieges, it won legitimacy. With each fortress reclaimed, each English outpost reduced to dust, Charles's monarchy looked less like a placeholder and more like destiny. Stone by stone, blast by blast, the Valois crown was remaking France. And the war's rhythm was changing. No longer a game of raids and chevauchés, it was now a methodical French routine. Assemble, bombard, conquer, repeat. England could sneer about cowards' weapons all it wanted. The cannons didn't care. They just kept firing. Henry VI had 2 crowns but no clue. The son of Henry V, the conqueror of Agincourt, was expected to rule 2 kingdoms with iron discipline. Instead, he ruled like a parish priest dropped into a battlefield. Pious, hesitant, and so unworldly that even his supporters muttered he was better suited to sermons than statecraft. This was not a man to hold France together. This was a man who couldn't even hold a meeting. While Charles VII was building standing armies and artillery parks, Henry VI was perfecting the art of doing nothing. His court resembled less a council of war and more a costume drama of grudges, silk sleeves hiding clenched fists. Dukes of Gloucester and Somerset clawed at each other over policy. York grumbled about being sidelined. Factions multiplied, knives sharpened, and the war, the actual war, slipped further down the priority list. The English treasury, already strained from decades of campaigning, collapsed under the weight of mismanagement. Soldiers went unpaid, garrisons starved, and castles crumbled from neglect. A soldier in Normandy might wait months for wages, only to be paid in IOUs that were as valuable as promises at a gambling table. Walking away from the banner wasn't betrayal anymore, it was the only way to eat. Back home, the people of England were less than thrilled. Taxes bled them dry, trade routes choked, and Parliament grew restless. Why pour silver into a war that seemed endless, when the king himself couldn't be bothered to lead it? Joan of Arc had electrified French morale. Henry VI drained English morale like a leaky wine cask. Even victories, rare as they became, were squandered by infighting. When one faction pulled off a success, the others undermined it out of spite. England wasn't just losing to France, it was losing to itself. The kingdom that had once fielded the most disciplined armies in Europe was now fielding noble egos too big to fit in a room together. And looming behind it all was a dynastic time bomb, the House of York. Richard, Duke of York, bided his time, watching Henry's failures pile up like kindling. Every castle lost in Normandy, every unpaid soldier, every botched policy brought England closer to implosion. The 100 Years' War was turning from an international conquest into the prologue of civil war. France didn't have to outfight England anymore. It only had to wait while its enemy gnawed holes through its own ranks. Charles VII understood this perfectly. Why risk reckless battles when England's own incompetence was already doing the heavy lifting? His cannons broke their walls, their factions broke their will. By the late 1442, it was clear to everyone but Henry VI that the dual monarchy was a hollow puppet propped on a throne. Normandy trembled, Gascony wavered, and England's so-called empire looked more like a bankruptcy notice written across a map. The boy who had inherited 2 crowns now looked destined to lose them both, and drag England down with him. Because England's war effort wasn't just waning, it was rotting, and the stench of failure carried all the way from Paris to London. By the 1442, England's supposed empire in France looked less like a realm and more like a threadbare cloak falling apart in the wind. Normandy, once the jewel of Henry V's conquest, now trembled on the edge of revolt. Gascony, the last bastion of Plantagenet pride, was restless too. France, once fractured, was coming back together, piece by piece, fortress by fortress, with cannon fire as the glue. Charles VII and his captains pressed the advantage methodically. No more desperate gambles, no more rash charges. They advanced with relentless pressure, reclaiming Normandy in 1449. Fortress after fortress buckling under Bureau's artillery. The English garrisons, unpaid and undersupplied, surrendered with a sigh more often than a fight. Rouen, Caen, Cherbourg, names that once echoed English triumph, now read like a casualty list of empire. Gascony was next. For 3 centuries, it had been England's prized possession, the source of its wine, wealth, and continental foothold. But by 1451, French armies surged south and pried it loose. Bordeaux, that proud city of claret merchants, bent the knee to Charles. For a moment, England rallied, sending its last great captain to reclaim it. But what followed was not salvation, it was Castillon. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, was England's last knightly hero, fearless, beloved by his men, and tragically allergic to common sense. In July 1453, he marched into battle against a French force entrenched behind earthworks and, crucially, protected by Jean Bureau's cannons. It was Agincourt in reverse. Talbot charged with courage, and gunpowder shredded him for it. The result was slaughter. English troops, still clinging to the myth that valor could conquer firepower, charged into a storm of iron and smoke. The French gunners turned the battlefield into a killing ground, and Talbot, the man who had embodied England's fading chivalry, was cut down with his son beside him. A dynasty of victories ended in a ditch at Castillon. The battle was more than a defeat. It was a death warrant. Castillon didn't just kill Talbot. It killed the English dream of France. With Gascony gone, Bordeaux surrendered again, this time for good. Normandy was already lost. All that remained was Calais, a token outpost clinging to the coast like a stubborn wart. England had once looked ready to devour France whole. Now, it had been spat back across the Channel, bloodied and humiliated. What Henry V had won in fire, Henry VI lost in drift and despair. The Plantagenet Empire, built over centuries, collapsed in a handful of years. For France, Castillon was more than victory, it was vindication. After a century of invasion, occupation, betrayal, and civil war, the Valois crown stood restored. For England, it was a reckoning. Their empire had ended not with glory, but with gunpowder blasting it apart. The 100 Years' War had reached its last toll, and Castillon was the bell. By the end of 1453, the map of France no longer looked like a checkerboard of English red and French blue. It was, at last, nearly whole. Normandy had been reclaimed. Gascony, that centuries-old Plantagenet jewel, was gone. Bordeaux poured its wine for Valois tables. The only English flag still fluttering on French soil clung to Calais, a coastal holdout more nuisance than empire. Charles VII, once dismissed as little more than a fugitive prince, could now style himself Charles the Victorious. His reign had begun in humiliation, his legitimacy bought on the pyre of a teenage girl. It ended in triumph, his crown secured not by chivalric charge, but by cannon smoke and bureaucratic endurance. France was no longer fractured and doubting. It was centralized, taxed, and defended by a king who had finally proven himself more than a stopgap. The transformation was staggering. A monarchy that had once cowered behind walls now commanded loyalty through coin and cannon. The Estates General, once courted for every scrap of war funding, found itself sidelined. Taxation was permanent, armies were permanent, and so was royal authority. France emerged not just victorious, but reshaped. The days of knightly feudal warlords were over. The state itself had hardened into a machine built for war. England, meanwhile, slouched home with nothing to show for a century of blood, but Calais, debt, and discontent. Henry VI, burdened with grand titles but utterly incapable of wielding them, presided over a kingdom exhausted by taxation and torn by factional hatred. The nobles who had bungled the French war turned their knives inward, and within 2 years, England would plunge into its own nightmare. The Wars of the Roses. The 100 Years' War was over, but the English civil wars were only beginning. For France, the war's close meant more than survival. It meant rebirth. The Valois crown had stared down near annihilation. Rebellion, foreign occupation, madness, heresy, fire, and emerged battered but unbroken. The humiliation of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt was buried beneath the cannons of Castillon. The English had arrived proclaiming conquest. They left whispering loss. The 100 Years' War had not ended as Edward III had imagined, nor as Henry V had nearly secured. It ended with a kingdom restored, a monarchy redefined, and the feudal order itself rewritten. France was no longer the battlefield of Europe. It was becoming Europe's great power. The 100 Years' War did not end with a treaty signed in glittering halls, nor with a last heroic duel between kings. It ended with a slow grind of taxation, artillery, and exhaustion, and with the quiet realization that England's age of continental conquest was over. For France, the century of nightmare had been baptism by fire. The monarchy that had entered the war, mocked and fragmented, emerged tempered by fire, anchored in permanent taxation, standing armies, and the authority of a centralized crown. Out of chaos, the modern French state had been forged. Charles VII, once a disinherited exile, stood at the war's end as Charles the Victorious. For England, the war's close was less a defeat than a collapse. The victories of Edward III and Henry V dissolved into bankruptcy, factionalism, and disillusion. The illusion of an English France collapsed at Castillon. Within 2 years, England turned inward, stumbling into the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic free-for-all that made France's chaos look almost tidy. The 100 Years' War was never really about a century of constant fighting. It was about transformation. Chivalry gave way to gunpowder. Feudal levies gave way to professional armies. Kingship itself shifted, from the feudal bargaining of vassals to the centralized tax-fueled power of the modern state. It began as a quarrel over a crown. It ended by remaking what kingship even meant. And out of the wreckage of Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, Orléans, and Castillon, a new Europe emerged, one where knights were relics, gunpowder was king, and the very idea of war had changed forever.